Hello Cebu, hello everyone. My name is Sara. I'm a technical writer at Google. And today I'm going to be talking about how to improve technical documentation using design principles. But before I get started, I would like to briefly introduce myself. I've been a technical writer for more than 10 years now, and I actually started my technical writing career in Cebu, Philippines. And I lived there for a few years, and after that, I moved to Singapore where I worked as a knowledge management specialist in an American company. After Singapore, I moved to Europe and I worked as a technical writer at SAP in Munich, Germany. After living there for a few years, I moved to Nantes, France. It's in the west coast of France, and I worked as a technical writer for a data integration company called Talent. And after that, I got the opportunity to work for Google. I'm now based in Dublin, Ireland, and I actually write hardware and software documentation for the Google Data Centers team. I have a master's degree in technical communication and localization from the University of Strasbourg in France. I also have a bachelor's degree in computer science from MSU IIT in the Philippines, and I'm also a certified professional technical communicator. I got my certificate from TechCom Europe. It's the European Association for Technical Communicators. And so that's it about me. Now let's get started.
So as I mentioned earlier, I've been working as a technical writer for many years. Whether it's hardware or, software documentation that I'm writing, my only goal is to help my users. I want to help them achieve their goals, whether, these users have to decide about, using the product, or these users want to know how to safely use the product, or maybe they want to accomplish certain tasks using the product, or maybe, let's say they're very advanced users and they want to extend the product. I want to create documentation that is helpful, that is useful for my users at any stage. However, it is also quite common that we technical writers face challenges of delivering useful content. It's not because we don't want to put more effort into knowing our audience and their needs, but sometimes it is really just difficult to achieve the expectations that we set to ourselves or to our documents. In one of my previous roles, I was given the task to manage an existing software documentation that was initially written by a non-technical writer. When I say manage, I have to create content based on new release versions of the software and also update existing content to ensure the updates are well documented. I'm pretty sure my fellow technical writers in the audience can probably relate to this statement from Edmund Weiss. He said, "Updating a manual is like changing tires of a moving car." I wouldn't say that updating a manual is impossible, as it is impossible to change the tires of a moving car. But it is indeed quite challenging to put the pieces all together, especially if the document was not written by a technical writer and did not follow technical writing basics and, style guides. Anyway, when the project was given to me, I immediately inspected the entire documentation. Why? Well, I have two reasons. Number one, I wanted to learn more about the product. Of course, the best way to know and understand the product is through the docs. And number two, I wanted to see how the documentation was structured and how I could update it. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that I read the overview page 10 times and still did not fully understand what the product was. So I actually took a step back and asked myself, if I, who's part of the development team and part of this organization building the product, if I do not understand what this product is about, what about those users who come to this help portal looking for answers? Do they leave and become even more confused? Luckily, I know someone in the development team who was patient enough to explain to me what the product was all about. I requested a favor from the developer and asked my teammate to demonstrate to me how the product works. And after that meeting with my colleague, I opened a documentation bug immediately and listed all of the items that can be improved in the docs. And of course, I'm the person in charge of that. I was the person in charge of that documentation, so I had to assign that bug to myself. And that bug reminded me that it has been open for several weeks and months because it was there in my bug queue. And every time I open it, it would remind me that, hey, Maryland, there is more to do. You're not done yet. Well, don't get me wrong. I was really, really interested to improve the document. It's just that I did not know where to start and how to start. I got really curious and I tried to think for strategies on how I can improve the documentation. So during that time, when I had that, problem of not knowing how to improve the documentation, I attended a class about usability engineering, and my instructor was one of the most knowledgeable professors I've ever met. Through him, I learned so much about user experience design and the design principles. And I learned about how designers are, creating materials for a more international audience, and how they consider different cultural groups and expectations. In the class, I learned that usability is all about context. My instructor wrote in his article entitled Context, Culture, and Usability that when a technical communicator or a writer knows where the user performs a process, they can develop materials for that specific environment. And if a writer is able to conform context or content to context, then they can create content that is easy to use. I remember on that day, I was like, wow, I'm finally going to have solutions to my problems about this complex project, that I'm assigned to work on. But of course, that did not really happen overnight. I mean, the answers did not, come knocking at the door, or, they didn't just fall from the sky straight into my laptop. I had to investigate and dig more about different design principles. And while I was doing my research, I read about the design principles listed in the Universal Principles of Design book by William Lidwell, Katrina Holden, and Jill Butler. And in that book, the authors listed around 100 plus principles. And, they've even grouped these principles in 5 categories, including, how a designer can influence the way a design is perceived, how can the designer help people learn from a design, how the designer can enhance the usability of a design, how a designer can increase the appeal of a design, and how the designer can make better design decisions. It's an absolutely interesting book, and if you have not read it, I encourage you to do so. Well, anyway, among the list, there were quite a number of principles that I thought can actually be applied to my docs. And so, what were these principles? So let's start with organizing content. So the first principle is the hierarchy of needs. According to the book, the design of the product must meet the very basic needs or the lowest level needs of the users before you address the higher level needs. At the very bottom of this hierarchy is functionality. Next is reliability. Third, usability. Fourth, proficiency. And fifth, creativity. In whatever product or design, you must meet the lowest level need, the very basic functionality. So let's take, for example, in terms of documentation, a printer user guide. This user guide must help the user or must provide instructions on how you can print a single document from your computer. Now, the higher level need would be something like, how would you connect the printer and your mobile phone via Bluetooth? How would you print via Bluetooth? Something like that. Now, the next principle is the entry point. In the book, the entry point is defined as the physical or attentional entry into the design. Do you believe in the saying, first impressions last? Well, I do. And poorly designed entry points discourage the users and drive them away. So users to technical docs, come to the technical documentation for a reason, and they're not there because they're having a tea break and they need a good book to read. Come on, guys. Technical documentation is not a novel or a comic book. I really hate to say this, but it's not really the most interesting thing that people want to read. So yeah, when users enter the design or the documentation, they actually just glance at a page and scan some of the text. And then they click on the link that they would find interesting or, answer what they're looking for. So now the third principle is consistency. And they say that a product or a technical documentation is more usable and learnable when similar parts are written in similar ways. Now, there are different types of consistency: aesthetic, functional, external, and internal. Well, I won't go into details for each type, but I want to focus on aesthetic and functional. So aesthetic consistency refers to, consistency of style and appearance. So we have to use it to establish unique elements that can be easily recognized. For example, the consistent use of logos, font sizes, image sizes, colors that we use in text. Functional consistency refers to consistency of meaning and action. So we use functional consistency to simplify usability and ease of learning. So for example, when we write titles for a documentation, we can't have something like how to connect your printer to your laptop, and then on the next section we would say connecting your printer through Bluetooth. It just does not have the same meaning. Or maybe clicking would not be the same, like click, tap. Something that is not consistent at all in your documentation. You might say something like, oh, click here, and then in another part of the documentation you would say something like tap or press or something that is, you know what I'm trying to say, right? So those are the three principles that I thought would be good to analyze or to investigate when we are actually creating or organizing the content or structuring the documentation. So now let's start with the design principles that I thought would be great when we create content. So first is readability. Readability is the degree to which prose can be understood. So it's based on the complexity of words and sentences. Readability is determined by factors such as word length, word commonality, sentence length, number of clauses in a sentence, and number of syllables in a sentence. And we have to make sure that complex material is expressed in the simplest way possible. The next is the picture superiority effect. I don't know about you, but for me, I actually learn better when I see things. So I'm a visual learner, and I actually absorb information when I look at things. So it is said that when you use the picture superiority effect, it can improve the recognition and recall of key information. So we have to use pictures and words together and ensure that they reinforce the same information, for optimal effect. Next is personas. The persona technique uses fictitious characters to guide decision making. Designers, writers create personas to understand the user's needs, goals, experiences, and behaviors. And personas actually help designers or technical writers create a good user experience for their target audience. Now, there are actually more design principles that can be applied, but I did not want to be too ambitious and check everything. So I thought I could start with a few and then build on that, when I get a chance. And so with those design principles in mind, I actually started to create a plan. To start my project plan, I conducted a user research. I asked the following questions. Who are the users? Who is basically my audience? What do they need? Why do they read the docs? And when do they read the docs? And because I really couldn't find the answers myself, I met and I spoke with different other teams. I met with the software development teams, the product manager, the UX researcher, and even my fellow technical writers to find the answers to my questions. I knew that being able to identify who the audience is will help me improve the docs. And so once I had that, I've then, wrote like a document about everything I knew about the users. So going back, one of the problems that I noticed when I accessed this complicated documentation set was the lack of the landing page. And I knew that I must create one. So when the user comes into the help portal and clicks, the product name and its version, they are then immediately greeted with a long page of content, just all text. And I remember when I first accessed the documentation and landed into that overview page, I actually freaked out. I got lost in the sea of texts. So I thought a landing page must be put in place to help the user access the content that they need or help them navigate through the documentation. And while designing the landing page, I used the entry point principle, and I actually combined it with a hierarchy of needs. However, for the hierarchy of needs, this was a bit tricky. I had to request help from the software development team to identify those things because I wasn't familiar with the entire product. And then I moved on and I actually checked our documentation style guide, and I made sure that all the topics, the titles, the callouts were all consistent. I went ahead and checked the other documentation available in the library to check, what my fellow technical writers have created. Interestingly, I also thought that creating personas would help me build the landing page. So what I did is I went back to the results of the user research that I conducted earlier, and then I created 3 fictitious characters. Each one had a name, Ray, Daniel, and Marta, and I wrote about each of their profiles, their level of experience, their expertise, when do they access the docs, etc. Combining all these principles of design, I was actually able to come up with a mock-up. I created 3 sections in the landing page to guide the user as they navigate through the documentation. And remember earlier that I mentioned about this sea of texts, this, really long overview page? I identified all topics or documents where images would be helpful. Of course, we must add images that only add value to the document. We cannot just, add images everywhere. It has to be added sparingly. And if an image does not add any value to the document, then there is no point in adding images there. And then finally, what I did was I randomly pulled some documents and calculated its readability score using the Kincaid readability tests. So, this scale, if you're not familiar with it, this scale shows 0 to 100. So if the document gets 0, that means it's unreadable. And if it gets 100, it means it's easy to read. And according to Rudolf Flesch, in his article entitled How to Write Plain English for Consumer Docs, the score must be at least 80, or that's about 15 words per sentence. And the result that I got when I did the calculation was kind of not so good. Let's just say I had plenty to edit and plenty of words to delete. After identifying all the action items that I must do, I went ahead and spoke with my manager. I explained that, I would like to work on improving the documentation. And I presented all the ideas, all my research results, and the project plan with the timelines and everything. And my manager thought it was actually a great idea. And so I got the approval. After getting my manager's approval, I spoke with the software development manager and the product manager. I even, created slides that explained the issues that I found, my proposed solution, and, the support that I needed to complete the project with a timeline. And I also explained to them, the benefits for doing so. Well, of course, they loved the idea, and they even offered to provide any support, technical or resources to help me complete the project. So there, when I got the green light, I started working on the project. I started actually with the landing pages. I thought that was really the most important thing, and I could roll it out as soon as possible. So I've created a landing page that caters to different users, potential users, new users, and advanced users. I also happily edited the content and deleted all the needless information. I've also shortened the sentences where I could. I added images where possible. I ensured the style guide is followed, and so on and so forth. I even updated the API documentation and made sure that it provides more information and it's descriptive enough for developers to use. And while doing all of those improvements, I've also figured out all the benefits that, all those things gave to not just to me, but also to the users and the company. So these are just some of the things that I thought were the benefits. Of course, number one, it improves the user experience. Remember the time I told you that when I accessed that overview page, I really freaked out and I said, oh my gosh, I really need to do something about it. That was my experience. Now imagine, thinking about the user's experience coming into the documentation and they did not know where to go. I mean, just that, really having a landing page that helps them navigate through the documentation without really scrolling through the table of contents, that huge or long table of contents, that already improved their user experience. Also, now the documentation is more useful for multiple audiences, because if there's like a potential user there who needs to decide whether the solution is good for them, they already know which topics they must read through. And also, if there's someone who's like more advanced, they know that they don't have to go through the overview page or the UI. They don't have to go through that. They just gonna go to the advanced features of the product. So that is more useful for them. And basically adding those links and pointing them to the correct direction, to the correct link, helps them and saves their time. And yeah, when they actually land to the correct pages, or when they are actually redirected to the topics that they're searching for, then the documentation actually helps the user accomplish whatever tasks they're planning to do, whatever tasks they need to do. And also, when the documentation is user-centered and when it's complete, it reduces the need for support. The users won't need to file bugs all the time or ask for customer or technical support, like how to do this and how to do that, because it's well documented. They can just go through the documentation and search for something, search for some topics, and they would be able to get through it and just following the documentation or the instructions or any procedure there. And yeah, it also promotes the product and its features, because now that we've identified who our users are, we're just gonna make sure that for each user, they have certain features of the product that you wanna let them know or you wanna inform them about. So yeah, I think these are just the benefits that I thought about, and for sure, when you also will implement this in your documentation set, you would also find more benefits. Yeah. So actually, that's all I have to say.
So that's it for me. Thank you very much for watching my talk. I hope you learned something, and I hope you have a few takeaways to bring with you. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, feel free to send them. I will respond to them as soon as possible. And also, I would like to thank the World Information Architecture Day organizers. Thank you for making me a part of this wonderful event. All right, so that's it. Thank you, everyone, and bye.